everyone for coming this afternoon. This is a bigger crowd than I thought we would have. I'm Shelly Williams. I am the not-so-new library director. Since I've been here a little over a year, I can't say new anymore. But I have only been here for about a year and 4 months. We have a new project that we're going to kick off today and announce everything that's going with it, so we hope you enjoy this. We're also happy all of you could join us and enjoy our refreshments, please. We don't want leftovers. I became interested in this project after talking to Tanya, and I have many reasons for being interested and excited about the library being involved in it. Being newly transplanted, I wanted to find out all about the area and what was going on. We did a little research before we moved here, and things were said like, oh, they're cleaning up and the water's wonderful, and I went, cleaning up what? We couldn't find what. I would get bits and pieces as I talk to people, but I'm glad we're on this end because we got to be here and we're going to watch it get better and better every year. When I was a youngster, my father worked for the Department of Wildlife, which everybody here knows is DNR, and he became their photographer. So since I was that high, I've been very interested in how the environment impacts us and we impact it. Since our library does have a history of collecting and storing historical data, this project just fits right in with what we do in our work. And I was also very interested and excited when Tanya suggested our collaboration on the project. On the agenda, which hopefully you have one, obviously first it says help yourself to refreshments. And then Tanya Kabala will give us an overview of the project we have developed and introduce our speaker for the afternoon. Then we're going to hear from our speaker, Dr. Alan Steinman of GFSU, Honest Water Resources Institute. You have to forgive me, I've only been here a year. And then finally we have the president of our board, Ernie Swetnowski, and he is going to have some closing remarks. And we want everyone here and that you talk to become involved in our project once you hear about it and understand what we're trying to accomplish. I hope you'll join us by becoming involved in many, many ways. You can submit your information from your life history, talk to an advisory council member or advisory committee member, help us get the word out about the project, about submitting your information from other people, participate in our blog, which Tanya is going to be in charge of, and link to our webpage for the project, which she's going to unveil. Or you can always make a contribution to help us keep the webpage up. Since the grant was only going to keep it up for a year, we want it to go for several years running. And now, we have Tanya Kabala. I don't have anything here to say, because she says, everybody here knows me. And I'm, okay, fine. She's going to tell you more about herself, how she came about this idea, and about our undertaking the project. And then she's going to unveil our webpage for you and introduce the speaker.
I think I told her I know almost everybody. So which is typical if you've lived somewhere your whole life. So anyway, really excited to see such a good crowd. You know, you get excited about a project and then you have a meeting about it, and you think, gosh, what happens if you have a meeting and nobody comes? That's always the worst thing. So, but fortunately, we don't do that often here in the White Lake area. I'm really glad. Appreciate your coming out today. I want to thank Shelly. She, I've gotten to know her through working with this project, and she and the library are an excellent partner. She just jumped right in. You know, she didn't take much persuading to get involved, and she's a wonderful asset to the community. She's involved in everything now, I think. This project has taken, I wanted to mention too, the catering is by the Book Nook, our lovely new Book Nook, although the hot appetizers are made by Lori Hesse. Those of you who know me know that that's my sister. I twisted her arm. The Book Nook's not able to do the hot appetizers, so I twisted her arm, and she's a wonderful chef, so she made that for us and me. So our help is S.C. Kettering over there. Karen Brandell, Mackenzie Brandell, and Marianne Walters, and then Claire Schlaffer helping with financial they never do these things without a lot of help. And then Debbie does did our dishes. So anyway, this project has taken a year to come to fruition. We started talking about it last September. And in May, we got funding support for it from the Michigan Humanities Council, Alcoa Helmet, White Lake Area Historical Society, Monty Museum, and Historical Association and Friends of the White Lake Community Library. So not only do we have funding from the state level, which actually comes from the national source, the Humanities for Arts, we also have local support as well. And do want to thank our sponsors. We have some of them here today. Ron Arnouts from the White Lake Area Historical Society. Where are you, Ron? Thank you. Jim Haley from the Montague Museum and Historical Association. Jim, in the back? Okay. We also have an advisory committee for the project, and we have some of them present here today. Not everybody. Roger Sharmer from the White Lake Area Historical Society. Norm Ullman and Claire Schlaf, representing the White Lake Public Advisory Council. Greg Means and Dan Yates, which is our local author, and I'm not sure I see him here. Anyway, this project came about mainly because we're getting, for most of you know this, we're getting close to restoring White Lake. It's an exciting time, but it's also been a time, at least for me, to start looking back really to know and understand what happened, for us to have the historical pollution problems, and also how we've been able to come back from those circumstances. Maybe it's because I'm someone who reads a lot and writes, but it just feels natural at this time to want to look back and think, what really happened, and what part did people play, what did people think about it, and then how did we get from there to here. And so this project is aimed at helping to answer those questions, and it is intended to fully involve members of the community in doing so. Whether you're a new member of the community or someone who's been here for a long time, if it's successful, it will because people in the community got involved and participated and had a good discussion. So this is really something that the library and we're doing together, but it's not our project, it's a community project. So about the project, we have a display coming. We're going to be creating a permanent display, and actually Ron Derby of Derby Design is going to be working with us, and that will actually travel around the community throughout this next year. And that will just be some images that will kind of stimulate your interest and discussion. We will have oral histories that will be videotaped by Oscar Rospo in the back. And we're going to be working with people in the community and interviewing them about their experiences, their memories, their recollections, their viewpoints, and that's going to be Oscar's job to work with us on that. That will begin in late October and November, and we actually have a sign-up sheet over there with Claire, if you want to put your name down there, talk to us about that. We're also taking written accounts, photos, information representing all of the viewpoints that were and are present in the community. We're not looking for just a small subset of the community. You don't have to have been active in whatever was happening at the time to be involved in this. This is open to everybody. For example, Roger Sharmer gave me a letter he wrote to Governor Romney of Michigan in 1968. I don't mean to date you, Roger, but anyway, he was suggesting that Bob Wesley be appointed to the state's Water Resources Commission, and he was concerned about issues in White Lake. So that's actually something that can be put up on in the information. And then we're looking for that information. Ideally, if you can get it to us in electronic format, that's best, because it will save us a little extra time and work. But if you have, hard copies, correspondence, photos, and things like that, you can drop them off or mail them to the library. And we do have a release form that we want you to fill out, so it's legal that we use these materials. What we have spent the most time to date is the website. And it's restoringwhitelake.com, and it's built by Bill Raphael, I wrote it down, and Colette Kufal of Raphael and Associates. And this is really is the central and most important part of the project. Here's where we're going to put everything that we receive from the community. Your photos, the oral history videos, written accounts, maybe some letters you found in your grandfather's collection. And we can, the primary focus is kind of our industrial pollution time. But even if there's information that dates back to, our early environmental history, we're interested in that. So it's going to be put here on the website, and the idea is that this is going to be a digital resource for everybody to use. So you can look up and you can see the photos, you can see, the accounts, and you'll get some sense of the history from this website. And it's for a couple of reasons. One, people are very much interested in digital resources. Some people probably, are maybe youngsters, I don't know, are not interested in reading a book. But, so at least we have this all in one place, once and for all. The other piece of it is we're hoping to go beyond this and to eventually bring all the stories together with factual research on the history and put that into a book. And that's all dependent on funding. So if for some reason we were not to be able to do that, we would still have this really good comprehensive resource. We have, Bill's going to help me go through. There's the welcome page. That's where you get to when you first get on there. And we're calling it Restoring White Lake because it's in progress. Exploring White Lake's environmental history. On the front page, you'll see all the places that you can click in and get involved, and those are the same links that are across the top. And if you contribute, everybody that contributes, we're going to put your name on the website. So, unless you don't want it there. So about the project talks about how it came about. Just kind of the idea of it and how it developed and the different project activities, who's sponsoring it, etc. The goals, links to all our sponsors. So if you ever want to know exactly what we're doing, there it is. I know it's a lot of words. Events, that's where if you want to know what's happening this year as far as events, all of the activities will be there. We're also going to be putting out news releases to let the Beacon and other places. The blog, I will be writing a couple times a month about a topic, and it might be spurred by somebody who's contacted me or some of the photos or things, but just writing about it. But the idea being is that hopefully people in the community will participate with that blog. I mean, it's like a meeting. You don't want to call a meeting and not have anybody there. You don't want to write a blog and not have anybody comment. It's just the worst thing. And so, but hopefully that will stimulate your questions and your thoughts and your own memory. So, your picture that that you're very welcome to participate in this. The history, that page we're still working on a little bit, and we're envisioning an interactive history timeline where all of the information that is submitted gets put. This explains how we want you to provide the information. It also has the release form and things like that. And ideally, when we finish working on this, which is coming up just this week, there may even be a way that you can submit things electronically, so you don't have to necessarily send it to us. But there's a contact form on the site. Photos, we will be selecting, certain of the photos that we get from the project and putting them in a photo gallery, although they will also be on that history page. And that history ideally will be in a timeline format, kind of like Facebook, right? So everybody should be familiar with that. Sponsors and partners, of course, Michigan Humanities Council, Alcoa Haumet, and the local Historical Society, Montague Museum, Friends of the Local Community Library, all of our advisory committee partners. You can see some of the folks that are not able to make it today. In addition to Dan Yates, we also have Dave Dempsey, who's an author, a Great Lakes author. So really, a great group of people volunteering their time to help out with this project. And where are we? The Get Involved page. That's where we tell you how you can get involved by contributing to the project. Okay, and then do we have one last one, Bill?
Yeah, the contact page.
Oh, contact page. And then, because we didn't want to put our emails there because we get too much spam already. So, but there's a way to specify, that if you have a submission, if you have a question, if you have a comment, different things like that. So anyway, so we have spent quite a bit of time working on this, and we certainly owe a big thanks to Bill and his associate Colette, because I know he was up in the middle of the night because I saw the email. and so he really worked hard to get us.
I had a deadline.
Yeah. Or we could roll it out. So anyway, and our logo, that's going to be on everything over there. So we're very excited about this. Anyway, after this year, we have educational events planned also. We have Dave Dunphy coming to speak. We are going to be putting on an oral history workshop, so if you want to learn how to do oral histories, you can come to that. We're hoping we can get some folks who can help us do some additional oral histories. There's going to be other conservation-themed activities, and then the family nights that are here at the library are going to be conservation-themed. So it's all tying together, just trying to get people excited about the topic and the people involved. And then if we get funding next year, we will go on to do the factual research, put this all into a book. And the book really will go farther, go back to logging, encompass all of that, look at our history, look at where we're at today, and kind of give an idea for what we're heading to. So kind of an exciting time. Bruce?
You mentioned Dave Dempsey, Tanya. Do you have a date yet for
Thanks for asking, Bruce. We're looking at October 30th. He hasn't confirmed, but on my email list, you will get that information, and then there'll be news releases to the paper. October, we're looking for Dave Dempsey in the evening here, and then we're looking at November 10th, a Saturday, for the oral history workshop, just to kind of get started. So, any questions? I didn't put you to sleep, did I? You're really here to hear Dr. Alan Steinman, and he's the director of the Grand Valley State University Annis Water Resources Institute. He is our main speaker. I was very happy to get him because he is a sought-after speaker, and I was wondering if Sunday might be hard for him. Anyway, his job is to help place White Lake's environmental history in context for us. And we asked him to do this because we think it's important for us and for the community to understand that context. It's going to help us better understand, the context, kind of the circumstances surrounding White Lake's environmental history. It will help us understand what happened, why it happened, what's been done to remedy the problems. Hopefully that will spur us to remember to act sustainably now and in the future. And hopefully it will help us look at a different vision for our community after being a Great Lakes area concern since 1985 and looking for a positive future forward. And we chose Dr. Steinman, I can call him AL, as a speaker because he's a perfect speaker to describe context, and I'll tell you why. He has an extensive scientific background in water resources, including a PhD in botany and aquatic ecology. His entire career, he had quite a bit of it in Florida, Lake Okeechobee, did I say that right? Has been focused on water resources. Is serving on a lot of high-level advisory boards. He's won numerous awards. We've been fortunate to have him as the Annis Water Resources Director since 2001. He has helped to put the Water Resources Institute at the top as the Great Lakes Research Center, right here in our own neck of the woods in West Michigan. He's a sought-after speaker, and what I like about Al, and this is why I wanted to have him here, is he can talk science to people like me. I'm not a scientist. He's a scientist, but he's not up here talking such that you can't understand him. He's a visionary. I know that because I've heard him speak. He's passionate about our water resources and their role in shaping the path that our communities take. So that's why I'm excited that he's here to speak tonight, and welcome him.
Thank you, Tanya. Thank you all for coming. I don't know how sought after I am, but it has been a busy Sunday. Usually I'm introduced as the husband of my wife. My wife's the director of Blanford Nature Center, and she had a hunt this morning out of the Nature Center to try and reduce some of the deer population out there. So we've been up since 4 a.m. dealing with that. So if I start fading, bear with me. Anyway, thank you for coming. And I'm really pleased to be here. It's great to see such community involvement. You guys have a lot to be proud about in White Lake for what you see on the cusp of delisting White Lake as an area of concern, which I'll talk about in a minute. And I just wanted to give credit to Tanya and this project. It's really, really important to understand one's history in order to know where to go in the future. And this is a wonderful project to show how that can be done. And it's exciting to be part of the kickoff for all of this. Last week, we had a seminar speaker come to the Annis Water Resources Institute, a world-famous biodiversity expert. And he put up a photo of the planet at the start of his seminar. And so it inspired me to do something similar. I'm not trying to plagiarize his ideas. But he put it up there and he asked us, when you look at that photograph, what do you think of first? So I'm asking you, what do you think of first?
Lots of water.
That's what we said. And he said, well, that's not surprising because you're a Water Resources Institute. But he wanted to focus on the green because he does biodiversity on the planet. But I still think water is the first thing to see when you look at our blue planet. And that's exciting. So from a global perspective, we recognize the importance of water. What you're doing is recognizing it on a local basis because ultimately water problems are local problems. And you're doing it just the right way. A little bit of geological history. White Lake is a drowned river mouth lake. We have a whole series of these up and down our coast here in Michigan. And what happened 15,000 years ago when the glaciers receded and went north, basically the land rebounded. Our sand dunes rebounded and they trapped this lake behind the dunes. And so you've got basically a very interesting system where the river comes down through the watershed. It enters into these wetlands, these large wetlands, before they come into this drowned river mouth lake, and then eventually it cuts a channel out to the big lake, Lake Michigan. Now we've navigated and we've channelized those connecting channels, but originally, like Duck Lake, they were kind of sinuous and working their way through here. And these systems are referred to as drowned river mouths because they got drowned behind the dunes. And so White Lake is unique in the sense that there are relatively few of these around the Great Lakes, but we do have a series up and down our coast. Muskegon Lake, Duck Lake, Pentwater Lake, Macatawa, all drowned river mouth systems. And they vary. They vary in their characteristics. They vary in the levels of impairment based upon their environmental history. We often use Pentwater Lake or Arcadia as a relatively pristine reference system when we're comparing it against Macatawa, which is the most impaired along the watershed. And then you go up to Muskegon. And White Lake is kind of in the middle. It certainly had its history of environmental abuses, which we'll talk about in a minute. But it's not as bad as some of the other systems. And as I told Tanya, if you wanted somebody to talk about the environmental abuses in White Lake, I'm probably not the right person to do that. You know, Tanya can do that. Norm can do that. Tom can do that better than I can. But what I'd like to try and do is touch upon those, but put them in a broader perspective, as Tanya mentioned. So let's talk a little about this history of problems. Obviously, logging is one of the major ones that occurred here back in the 1800s. You've seen these photographs before, where they basically, I mean, for lack of a better term, they raped the environment. When the lumber barons came here in the 1840s, they said that there's a century's worth of lumber that they can harvest. When they got going in the 1860s, it lasted 9 years. Now, you talk about having a non-sustainable type of practice. We don't want to use this model for our water resources, because right now, you'll hear a lot of people talk about how abundant the water is in the Great Lakes. Same thing they were saying 150 years ago about the lumber. Right? It's amazing what humanity can do when they want to exploit a system. And we want to make sure, and I'll talk about this in a minute, we want to make sure we use the water, but we use it wisely. We use it sustainably. And then as a function, after the lumber industry died, it went bust, we started having all of this other types of industry move in. In the White Lake area in particular, you had Whitehall Leather, you had Hooker Chemical, Occidental, the municipal sewage all went in there through most of the 1900s until the Federal Clean Water Act was passed in 1972 and this started to be changed. As a function of all of this industrial discharge to White Lake, we had fish kills. The fish were tainted, you didn't want to eat them, and you had a lot of aesthetic problems associated with this. These plumes which would go out onto the lake, too many nutrients which would fuel algal blooms, you'd have these bad odors, the sediments would accumulate all of these contaminants and bury them in the sediments and cause problems. And then when you have a lot of algae that are growing, they die, they settle to the bottom, and the bacteria start to eat at them. And the bacteria need to breathe just like we do. And when we breathe, what do we take up? Oxygen. Well, the bacteria are sucking up dissolved oxygen out of the water as well. They can suck up so much oxygen that they can actually create anoxic conditions where there's very, very low oxygen. Just like in the Gulf of Mexico, these dead zones, we can get these in our lakes, and White Lake used to get that too. Now, they're not dead in a true sense. There's still life in there, but it's all bacteria. It's not stuff that you normally want. The fish don't have enough dissolved oxygen to live, and that's really what you want in these systems for recreational purposes. And that's what you don't get when you get too much algae decomposing. So that's what we mean when we hear this reference to a dead zone. Don't think that it's biologically dead. It's just not the kind of life you want. So you've seen these kind of photographs before. Hyde Island from Tannery Bay, the barrels from Hooker Chemical. These are the kinds of legacies, the past abuses that you've experienced, that we've experienced here in the White Lake area, the kind of stuff that we've spent a lot of time and energy trying to restore. And these photographs show the purple mayonnaise associated with the cores from Tannery Bay. And now we're starting to get into this restoration phase to try and take us out of the past and into the present. When we have tanneries, we end up having a lot of chromium because they use hexachromium divalent number 6 as a tanning agent. And what we did at the Annis Water Resources Institute is we measured the chromium in your sediments. The warmer the color, the redder, the oranger, the higher the concentrations. And the highest concentrations in White Lake were right around Tannery Bay, not surprisingly. This is what we mean by these contaminated sediments. This is the kind of stuff that not only creates environmental problems, because the bugs don't want to live in this, but it also can create human health problems. And this is why these sediments have been removed. About 75,000 cubic yards of contaminated sediment were removed from Tannery Bay at a very, very expensive cost. We're paying for these ecosystem restoration projects now because of these past environmental legacies that we deal with. As a consequence, White Lake is listed as an area of concern, or an AOC. In 1985, the International Joint Commission listed 42 areas of concern around the Great Lakes in both Canada and the United States. These were the toxic hotspots. White Lake, Muskegon Lake were 2 of those 42. I kind of joke in a not very funny way that Muskegon County is the proud owner of 2 AOCs around the Great Lakes. There's no other county that can make that claim. And it was originally listed because of 2 major reasons. The contaminated groundwater from Occidental working its way towards White Lake as a subsurface plume. And then there were 8 other sites, contaminated sites identified, including Tannery Bay as one of these 2 critical areas. And these both have been addressed over the last 20 years or so, as we'll see here. There are 14 beneficial uses that the IJC identified for these water resources in the Great Lakes. These are the 14 assets we want. And so, in theory, if you're really, really impaired as an AOC, you could have all 14 beneficial uses impaired. That's a beneficial use impairment, or a BUI. I apologize for the acronyms. I did not create them. But if I use them, I want you to understand what I'm saying and what they mean. White Lake only has 8 of those 14. You can take pride in the fact that Muskegon Lake has 9, so you've beaten by 1. But you really want as few as possible, right? And to be delisted as an area of concern, you have to deal with all 8. All 8 need to be addressed. So I just want to briefly go through each of these 8 so you know why your lake was listed as an area of concern and they're being dealt with. The first is restrictions on fish and wildlife consumption. If you have too many contaminants in the system, they will eventually work their way into the fish and wildlife. You don't want to eat them. It's bad for the fish and wildlife themselves, but it's also bad for human consumption. Eutrophication means there's too many nutrients. So you have nutrient runoff coming either from the watershed or from around the lake itself or from industrial discharge. You can have restrictions on drinking water consumption, again, human health related, in this case, thanks to Occidental's plumes getting into White Lake. You can have degradation of fish and wildlife populations. This is a reflection both of the contaminants getting into them and poor habitat. So you don't have the kind of natural fish and wildlife you want in your system. The aesthetics can be degraded, obviously, when you have algal blooms or oil scums or other kinds of industrial discharge plumes on your lake. That's not what you want. That's not what the Chamber of Commerce wants. Benthos are the critters living on the bottom, the benthic invertebrates that are there, and you want to have healthy invertebrate community because the fish eat those. And if you have good inverts, you're going to have good fish populations responding to them. Restriction on dredging activities. If your sediments are contaminated, you can't dispose of them easily. You need a special confined disposal area. That costs a lot of money. This is the kind of thing you want to clean up as well. And then finally, you want to improve your habitat. All right? Because the habitat is what drives your fish and wildlife to those areas. So all 8 of these need to be dealt with. They have been dealt with over time in the White Lake area. And you are very, very close. You're on the cusp of being delisted as an area of concern, which is something that you should take an enormous amount of pride in. Only 2 of the 40, actually there was another one added from after 1985, so there are 43 AOCs. In the Great Lakes, only 2 have been delisted to date. You're on the cusp of being the 3rd. That is something to really celebrate. That is really cool. So, what are the milestones in restoration? And you can go back earlier, but in 95, every AOC has to have a remedial action plan, or a RAP. Here's another acronym I'm throwing at you. That's developed by the Public Advisory Council, which has been done by the local people, including Tanya. Also in 95, the investigation began into Tannery Bay as a contaminated site. 7 years later, those 75,000 cubic yards of contaminated sediment began to be removed. In 2003, Hooker Chemical was dealt with removal of contaminated sediments and starting to deal with that plume, that contaminated groundwater plume was being dealt with purge wells. Between 2006 and 2010, White Lake identified what the beneficial use impairments are and what the restoration goals and targets need to be. And we worked with the folks up here in developing those goals and targets. The DuPont site began to be investigated in 2010. The upland site cleanup began in Tannery Bay in 2010, was completed in 11, and hopefully in the near future that will be finished and you'll have some condominiums and other development going in there. And then the Muskegon Conservation District began with local partners the Shoreline Habitat Restoration Project in 2011. Again, restoring that habitat to bring back the fish and wildlife populations to get White Lake delisted as an AOC. And I just want to compare this briefly with Muskegon Lake, because there's a lot of parallels between the 2 systems, but there's also a few differences. Muskegon Lake, just like White Lake, went through that lumber industry. This is a shot. Well, it's not a shot, it's a drawing of Muskegon Lake. In 1963, there were 47 sawmills on Muskegon Lake that were actively lumbering at that.
18.
I'm sorry, what did I say? 18. So, thank you very much. Once you hear murmuring, you know you did something wrong. I'll attribute that to the 4 a.m. awakening. 47 sawmills, about 18% of the original surface area of Muskegon Lake has now been filled in by sawdust, by slab wood. You take that 18% surface area, that is larger than 90% of the inland lakes in the state of Michigan that we've lost in Muskegon Lake. So, downtown Muskegon, Western Avenue, which is the main drag, Muskegon Lake originally went up to Western Avenue. So it's amazing how we've changed these landscapes as a function of these kinds of activities. And we, too, had our industrial abuses. This is downtown Muskegon, 1928, the Teledyne and Continental Motors factory. I don't know what that plume is, but it ain't good. And then we did direct dumping from these trucks or direct discharge right into Muskegon Lake. I mean, unbelievable kinds of... We treated Muskegon Lake, just like White Lake, was treated as a sewer. I mean, there's no 2 ways about it. So, with that uplifting past, I want to bring us into the present. There's actually a lot of good news in that, because in the last 20, 30 years, we've learned about these environmental abuses. We've learned about what kind of health impacts it have, and we've started to make these kinds of restoration activities a reality. We've found the resources, we've engaged the community, and we've made a difference. And that's really worth celebrating. So now, in White Lake, you've got some fish populations, the perch populations are coming back. They've had a couple of really good years of recruitment. You've got the marinas for economic development and recreational development going on in White Lake. For the last 5 years, 6 years, we take our vessel, one of our research vessels, the W.G. Jackson, up here for White Lake Days. There's your fearless leader, Tanya, giving a narration about what's happened here in White Lake. Greg Munn, who's also been very involved in the restoration activities up here, is also one of our speakers here. And so these provide educational opportunities. I don't know how many of you have actually been on these cruises, but thank you. In the future, when we come up next year, I hope you will participate, go on this, hear what Tanya has to say as part of these narrations. It's fascinating. And you have an opportunity to do hands-on sampling, where you sample the sediment, you sample the water, and you get to experience this. What I often tell people when I go and give you a talk, and I'm not offended by this, you may retain, after tomorrow, after maybe tonight, you may retain 10% of what I tell you today. That's about average. No matter how compelling a speaker I am, about 10 to 15% is what you retain. If you do it, if you actually do the sampling, you retain 50 to 70% of what goes on. No matter how bad the speaker is, although in Tanya's case it's different. But doing it makes a difference. So please, if you have the opportunity to go out on the Jackson when we come up next summer, take advantage of that. These trips are free, and so you should make yourself available. And please come down to Muskegon, come down to the Annis Water Resources Institute and see what we have going on down there as well. So you have incredible aesthetics. You know, Pure Michigan has now got White Lake on their website. You know, and so that's pretty cool in terms of Michigan's advertising. You have tremendous amenities here. You have the advantage of being a small town. I mean, when Tanya talks and says she knows everybody in this room, that is really cool. You know, when I speak in Muskegon, I may know 25% of the people there because we tend to be a bigger city. The small town amenities, getting to know people, makes a difference. Being able to enlist an environmental history project and get all of you engaged is really, really cool. And so I love that. You know, if my wife didn't have to drive to Grand Rapids every day, we would certainly think of living up in the Whitehall-Montague area. You have a lot of advantages in terms of your land use and your watershed. The green is shades of undeveloped, natural cover. Over 60% of this watershed is still in natural vegetation. That means you're going to have relatively healthy systems, a healthy watershed, a healthy lake. You're not there's not too much abuse coming in off the watershed. You still have a fair amount of agriculture. That's the brownish colors in certain parts of the lake. But agriculture is something that actually we should be taking advantage of in the future. Just make sure that the ag is done in a sustainable way. You have blue water trout streams here. Again, tremendous recreational opportunity. Taking advantage of the water in a non-exploitive fashion. These kinds of natural resources are something that can really be built upon, and you know this. I want to point out a study that was done about 5 years ago by the Brookings Institution. John Austin, who I'm working with right now on various projects, put together, and he identified originally, let me back up a minute, originally about 1,500 people around the Great Lakes developed, with an executive order from President Bush actually in 2004, a Great Lakes regional collaboration. And we got together and said what it would take to restore the Great Lakes. And we identified projects, and we said it would cost about $25 billion, that's with a B, to restore the Great Lakes the way it needs to be restored. And so the Brookings Institution took that number, took those projects, and said if we invested that $25 billion in the Great Lakes, their economic return on that investment would be $75 billion, a 3-to-1 return on our investment. And what I've done is I've collapsed all of their reports. You know, I took 78 pages and made it into one table. So obviously this is very simplifying. And if you looked at the total restoration benefits, this represents new habitat, commercial fishery, recreational fishery, ecotourism. That would generate about $18 to $30 billion in return. And then the improved housing environment with improved property values would generate another $30 to $40 billion, which gets you to that $75 billion out of that $25 billion investment. So ecosystem restoration not only makes sense in terms of the environment, makes sense in terms of human health, it makes sense in pure economics, clearly, by these kinds of studies. And that's what you've got going on here in White Lake. You will see the benefits to this in terms of your local economy, particularly once White Lake is delisted. It makes a lot of sense to go down this route. We've done the same thing in Muskegon Lake. In fact, we're restoring a shoreline habitat just like you're doing in White Lake. This was a NOAA-funded project, $10 million that we received in Muskegon Lake to take these hardened shorelines. This is some of our past environmental abuse. They can be hardened with riprap, it can be seawall, it can be slab wood, it can be slag, all sorts of crap. And we're removing it, and we're softening the shoreline. So we have a nice gentle slope, we're planting native vegetation. What will happen is the vegetation will come back, the aquatic plants will come back, the critters will come back, the fish will come back. And we too did an economic study, working with Dr. Paul Isley from GVSU's economic department, and working with our lab to identify what this $10 million project would return in investment. And Paul's first analysis suggested that that $10 million would bring back $58 million to the local Muskegon economy. And when we presented these data to the NOAA economists in Washington, D.C., they didn't believe us. So they invited Paul. They didn't really invite. They told Paul to come to Washington and present his data. And Paul did so. And I think the only other way to say this, he was interrogated by these economists. And when they finished, they bumped Paul's $58 million to $66 million. So it was pretty impressive. So this is a 6.6 to 1 return on our investment here in Muskegon Lake. And all I say is ecosystem restoration projects not only pay for themselves, they pay more than for themselves in many, many different ways. So with that present in place, with us moving towards ecosystem restoration, restoring the values that we have, where do we go in the future? And one of the projects that John and Austin and I are working on, amongst others around the state of Michigan, is this blue economy, or blue water economy. You may refer to it in different ways. And this is defined in a very simplistic way as taking advantage of the abundance of our water resources, freshwater resources here in the Great Lakes region to grow our economy. And I italicize take advantage because I don't want to use that in the way that the lumber barons took advantage of our lumber resources, right? We want to take advantage of them in terms of using them to grow our economy, but to do it to make sure that the fresh water, the water quantity and water quality are available for future generations as well. We want to use our water wisely. John's narrating here, and I will paraphrase for him, because what they're talking about how is we need to use our water here in the Great Lakes region to grow our economies. The water provides a tremendous, tremendous economic engine in terms of ecotourism, boating, fishing. People are being driven to the water, and we might as well be wise in terms of our use of our water resources. They go to Duluth, they show Cleveland, they show Macomb County.
We're still trying.
Oh, okay.
It's not coming through, is it?
No. Somehow it's muted somewhere in the system. And this is an economist at U of M Flint talking about how this really is an important driver, which I've been telling you anyway over the last couple of slides, reinforcing that in terms of a 3-to-1 investment from John's study, 6-to-1 investment based on the work here in Muskegon. And this doesn't come as any shock to anybody in this audience, right? I am preaching to the choir here. You're here because you believe in White Lake, you believe in the water resources of this community, and you know it's important to bring them back to the point where people can use them in a wise and sustainable fashion. And this just goes to that very element. So the kinds of ways that we can use the blue economy, recreation and tourism here around the White Lake area in various venues. Another area for the blue economy is in terms of retaining and attracting new businesses associated with manufacturing. Water is an important resource for manufacturing. We want to make sure that we retain the important industries in our area, but also attract new industries that use water in a sustainable fashion. So what might those new businesses be? Well, one example would be this water energy nexus, where we're looking at growing algae as a biofuel. Now, right now, there's a lot of resources and policy in this country devoted towards growing corn for ethanol. It's an absurd use of a food stock. Not only does it require a lot of water for irrigation of corn, but it requires nutrients to grow them. Why not take areas like farm ponds or wastewater treatment lagoons that already have a lot of nutrients, grow the algae in them. We have a much smaller footprint. We don't need to apply the water or the nutrients, and develop these algae. Now, it's going to take research. It's going to take research to find the right algal strains. I'm not saying this is something that can be done overnight. It's going to take research to figure out the best way to extract the hydrocarbons and use them. But these are the kinds of entrepreneurial businesses that we should be exploring and thinking about for the future, given the resources that we have in this area. Another thing is exploiting our agriculture and aquaculture industries. In downtown Milwaukee, Growing Power is a tilapia farm. They're repurposing old warehouses in order to grow the tilapia. Then they take this wastewater And in a closed-loop system, they grow vegetation with it. So why not take some of our buildings that may be abandoned or not being heavily used and use it? Now, I know you're doing this in the White Lake High School, right? One of the high schools here has, it's one of the science teachers? Montague, excuse me, sorry. You know, there's a divide. In Montague, but some really cool work is being done there. But you know, this could be expanded. You can bring in the capital to try and do something like this. These are great, really interesting ideas to do this. Food processing is certainly another area, given the amount of produce that's grown in this area, and take advantage of that as well. Now, one thing you do want to do when you start looking at agriculture, and if we grow this industry, we want to make sure that the agriculture is done in a wise way, because we don't want to create more problems. And I just want to point out a study that we've been doing just north of Mona Lake in these celery fields, and you have celery fields along the White River as well. We have them in north of Bear Lake as well. And what we found in these celery fields, and I just showed them here, if you look at an aerial, here's Lake Michigan at the bottom, here's Mona Lake, and then these celery fields. There's Black Creek that goes between the two, and they've got a levee. But in these cuts in the levee, you can see this algal bloom coming out of the celery field into Black Creek, and it's flowing into Mona Lake. It's only about 100 yards away from Mona Lake. So there's a lot of nutrients in these fields. And this is the only data slide I have. This is total phosphorus. Phosphorus grows algae. And this is in micrograms per liter or parts per billion. This is the limit, 25 micrograms per liter, that you want in your lake. White Lake is around 20, so you're below that limit. That's good. We can see Little Black Lake at the south end of Norton Shores is quite low. Mona Lake is up around 80, well above what we want. Muskegon Lake's right at that limit. Spring Lake was very high before we applied alum. It's come down since then. But look at these two flooded former celery fields. Orders of magnitude higher than what we want. So what we don't want to do when we restore the celery fields along the White River is we don't want to connect them to the river unless we take care of the nutrients that are going to be coming out of these fields. Otherwise, we're going to start creating new problems associated with our system. And there are ways of dealing with these nutrients, and we're dealing with them right now in Mona Lake and Bear Lake. But it's just a point of caution that agriculture is an important element of our future. But again, like any industry, it needs to be done in a wise and sustainable fashion, because you don't want to have these kinds of algal blooms that have potential toxicity associated with them in White Lake. That's Mona Lake, by the way. So what can you do? Well, what we've done in Muskegon Lake is we've set up a long-term monitoring program to identify what the trends are in the ecological health of the lake. And we use this information to delist Muskegon Lake as an area of concern. And we've come up to White Lake, and we've certainly done scientific studies up here on an ad hoc basis, but not in a continuous, sustainable fashion. And this can be done in White Lake. I am not advocating that AWRI do this work. I am not here shilling for business. A lot of companies could do this kind of work. I'm just suggesting it as an area for future types of activities to understand what's going on in your lake. And I want to show you why it's advantageous besides just having a scientific database for your lake. You can engage your community in the process. We set up an endowment fund at the Community Foundation for Muskegon County. People can donate and really feel like they're owners in this process. We go out and we sample 6 sites in blue around the lake on a quarterly basis. We also have a buoy that has an observatory associated with it. We put these data in a database that's available on the web so people can look at it whenever they want. The kind of products and outcomes that have come out of this are 4 graduate student theses, a lot of publications which really don't make a difference. The thing that really does make a difference is that with a relatively modest endowment fund, it's about $200,000, so it generates about $8,000 a year. It's not a lot of money, but it goes towards dedicated long-term monitoring. We've been able to leverage that money for additional grants, and we brought in over $2.5 million in additional funding in the last 8 years thanks to this relatively modest endowment fund. When people know, when funding agencies know that you've got a dedicated source of funding for long-term monitoring, and they know that you've got community involvement, community engagement, community ownership, these are the kinds of projects they want to invest in. And we use that to our advantage. So, last slide, just to summarize. I can't say this often enough. You guys have a lot to be proud of. You've done a really incredible job. It's something that should be celebrated. This project is a great way to invest in yourselves and highlight what's been going on in the White Lake in terms of your environmental history. And I give a tremendous amount of credit to Tanya, Shelly, and all the people who have been working on restoring White Lake over the last 30 years, 40 years. Not a trivial exercise. I admire your persistence. And it's nice to, I'm sure, reach some kind of fruition here. Water is part of our identity in this region, but it can also serve, or can serve as an economic engine associated with that identity. I caution you that while we want to use it to retain and attract water-dependent businesses that are consistent with the small-town character of Whitehall and Montague, generate that blue economy, we also want to make sure that we use it in a sustainable way so that the water quality and water quantity are available for future generations as well. So thank you for your time.
I have a question. You talked about one of the studies that President Bush commissioned in 2004 where you went into the economy of what cleaning up the lake was. Now, I noticed a large part of that was housing prices. Can you really count that now?
Well, let me back up. So, what Bush gave an executive order
Correct.
for restoring the Great Lakes, and so what that did was started this regional collaboration, which came up with a price tag for what it would take to restore all of the Great Lakes of $25 billion. And then the Brookings Institution took that dollar value, and they estimated that the total value would be $75 billion. So I just want to clarify.
Okay.
I'm not shilling here for George W. Bush.
Okay,
but
no,
I also don't want to malign somebody unnecessarily.
No, okay, you're right, I apologize. There was a Brookings Institute, but they based a lot of that on the price of housing, that part of the economic coming back would be on the
The real
housing
estate
price.
values.
Yeah,
Yes.
which I don't know that we could count that now.
You mean because of the current?
The current situation, in 2004, houses.
2007 is when they did this study. But,
Okay,
you know, and I'd have to go back to the actual study to see how they did the hedonic value pricing for this. And John should be here, not me, trying to defend those numbers. So I can't tell you.
I don't mean to be critical.
No.
Yeah, it's just a question, yeah.
You'll have to do better if you're going to offend me. But again, that study is available online, and if you're really interested in getting into the depths of it, I would certainly point you towards that so you can evaluate it. I think the numbers, I mean, knowing Brookings Institution, I feel pretty confident that they were rigorous in those numbers, but yeah, they might be inflated given today's economic, everything might be inflated, to be honest. But even a 2-to-1 return on an investment.
Yeah, it's still a good, I didn't, like I said, I
think
didn't
Warren
mean to be
Buffett would be
critical, I
happy
was
with
just.
that. No, I just want to clarify.
It's just interesting to me, a lot of my friends are telling me that what we really need to do is just to get the government out of our business, get these regulators, get rid of them, and these problems will be solved by themselves. I find it interesting that Bush, that they also say your science don't matter. So I was wondering, just a straight answer, do you think that if we just left it alone and got the government off our back, that we'd solve these problems ourselves?
Absolutely not. I mean, White Lake is a case study of what happens when you let business go unregulated. And I realize
Very strong argument on that.
this is a strong argument. And I would also argue why science is important. And again, I'm preaching to the choir, so I apologize if it sounds like I'm on a soapbox here. But as part of, to get back to the Great Lakes Regional Collaboration, in 2004, when Bush did this executive order, there were 4 scientists from the Great Lakes that were invited to testify in front of Congress. And I'm pleased to say I was one of them that did that. And as part of the congressional testimony, you have to submit your written testimony before you do that. And the chair of the subcommittee that we were testifying in front of was looking at my written testimony, and at the bottom of like page 4 of 10 pages, it said something like, people are sick of studies. And they are. People want to see action. The kind of reaction I often get when I say we need to study this more is, oh my God, not more studies. And then if the congressman had turned the page, which he didn't, he would have seen at the top of the next page, at page 5, that yes, we're sick of studies, but let me tell you why it's important that we do studies. It's because that investment in the science, that relatively modest investment in the science will tell you what's the right course of action to do so you don't spend millions of dollars foolishly on a project that won't solve the problem. And that's the real value of science. And making sure that that science, you don't want bad science, obviously. You want to make sure your science is peer-reviewed, right, and it's replicable. But that's an investment that makes sense, all right? And, you know, I'm not going to even say who the congressman was. He's still in office. It wasn't our representative.
Yeah, question. I rode a bicycle today in the bike trail between Montague and Whitehall. You look into the marsh, and the marsh is absolutely dry. And so, like, where's the water going?
Well, that's a really good question. We're 23 inches below the long-term mean in Lakes Michigan and Huron. They're treated as one hydrologic unit. And what's happened is that a lot of that, we've actually identified it. I've been part of this 5-year study looking at the water levels in the upper Great Lakes over the last 5 years. The study's almost done. So part of it, a small amount is going, there's more of it going out of the bottom of Lake Huron because of dredging in the St. Clair River. That's about 15%. There's another, 5% that's associated with, and I'm not going to get geeky on you, but we call it glacial isostatic rebound. As the glaciers have receded, it turns out that there's, the bottom, Chicago, where the glaciers receded first, have rebounded more. So there's a tilting that's gone on in the Great Lakes. So you have a little bit associated with this tilting, associated with glacier recession. But most of it, 80%, is associated with climate. We have less precipitation overall, and we have more evaporation. What's happened as the waters have warmed, due to warming air temperatures, we get less ice cover in the Great Lakes because the water retains that heat through the winter. And when you have less ice cover, you get more evaporation. Anybody know what month of the year we have the greatest amount of evaporation off of Lake Michigan?
January.
November. What happens is the water is still relatively warm, and you get these cold fronts coming out of the Arctic, down Canada, and when that cold air goes over that relatively warm water, if there's no ice cover, you'll have a huge amount of evaporation. Well, that has continued now through December and January and February as we've had less and less ice cover, so you have more water evaporating, going into the atmosphere, and then being deposited in Rhode Island or Massachusetts or over the Atlantic Ocean. And that net basin supply has declined dramatically over the last 20 years, which is why we've had this constant recession. And honestly, you look at the long-term climate forecast, there's nothing that indicates this is going to change in the near future. So that's why this 5-year study that was funded by the International Joint Commission has looked at the possibility of actually putting water retention structures in the St. Clair River to hold the water back. As bad as it is in the marsh around White Lake, it's nothing compared to Georgian Bay. People cannot get to their docks in Georgian Bay because there's actually a shelf between where the homes are and the open water of Lake Huron, and they can't get in and out. And these people, the Georgian Bay people, are the ones that are really complaining in terms of access. So it's not just an environmental consideration. Again, it all gets back to economics. This is what I tell my students all the time. You will never be able to understand or solve environmental problems if you don't understand economics, because that's what drives these issues ultimately, and that's where the solutions lie. You need to have multidisciplinary approach to these things.
You touched on the IJC. I understand from reading their materials that that's another place where these issues have been quantified in terms of transportation, recreation, fishing, the other major uses of the water resource in the Great Lakes. Each of those quantified, and even according to water level. In other words, what is a target water level for how much you let out of Superior down through the St. Mary's River and so on down into the rest of the system, and what the economic consequences in each of 5 major areas will be. So if people want better, more up-to-date numbers from international studies, the IJC is a good resource to go to for this.
Absolutely. As part of that study, we looked at you talk about a no-win situation. Very briefly, the study board, which are the commissioners from the Canadian and American sides for the IJC, the International Joint Commission looks at transboundary issues, not just the Great Lakes, but they're also working over in British Columbia and Washington State for anything dealing with Canada and the U.S. Well, this study was to look at the actually 6 major areas around the Great Lakes that are impacted by water level, and then they were going to come up with a new regulation schedule for the upper Great Lakes to try and balance all of these competing needs. I served on the ecosystem side of this, trying to identify the best water schedule for ecosystems, but there were other people, as Bruce mentioned, looking at things from real estate values, energy production, navigation, all of these different sectors, and then the study board tried to take all of these different performance indicators and come up with one plan that will basically, piss off everybody equally. For lack of a better term. And they've actually released that regulation schedule. They actually had public meetings this past summer, but they've extended the public comment period. If you are interested, go to their website, www.iugls, International Upper Great Lakes Study.org. And you can get all the more information than you ever wanted on 5 years worth of studies and also the final report that we generated, if you're looking at this. But if you look at the solutions that we've potentially talked about, putting these structures in the St. Clair River, it has other consequences. As Tom can allude to, some of the places they're talking about putting these kinds of structures in are critical sturgeon habitat. I mean, you don't want to screw that up. We've talked about possibly putting these water retention devices that might also have energy production through turbines. So there's all sorts of interesting ideas, different types of inflatable bladder structures, so you can deflate them when if the water levels go back up, inflate them, water levels go down. They're billions of dollars, and it would take years of permitting to get these approved. And of course, the Army Corps of Engineers would be overseeing this in terms of this from a navigational perspective. So there would be a lot of pressure that would be needed to be placed on them. Not to say they can't be done. Anything can be done if there's enough political will and economics behind it. But right now, my guess is that these suggestions will be put out there, but it's highly unlikely they'll be acted upon. That's just my guess.
Yeah, as I understood, their conclusion was to do nothing because that was better than any of the other options.
They made no formal recommendation. When they were charged with this task, they were told not to give recommendations, but that is one of the options. It's always an option, for these kinds of studies, depending upon what the prevailing approaches are. So, the one area that we did strongly, I wouldn't say recommend, the strong conclusion for this was that we need to make sure that we have adaptive management in place, because with climate change, conditions are not going to remain static, and we want to make sure that we're nimble in how we deal with this. And I think that's
What does that mean?
Well, if water levels keep going down, you want to make sure that you have the ability to deal with that. So maybe these structures will become more politically palatable than they were previously. Or let's say that marinas end up being threatened more, making sure that there's more dollars available for dredging. It depends on the sector that you're dealing with, but you don't want to look at the conditions as being, this is what they've been, this is what they will be. They will change.
Yes, do invasive species, both plant and animal, factor in at all as to your future restoration plans for these waterways, and if so, how?
They definitely factor in. So, depending upon the species of concern, if we're talking about something like Phragmites, an invasive plant coming into our marsh systems, low water levels are very, very good for Phragmites to come in. We don't want Phragmites. So here's another example. As the water levels recede, we want to have a lot of monitoring in place to identify these areas where they're starting to come in and maybe get established, because the best time to get rid of an invasive species is when, well, the best part is never to allow it to get in to begin with, but if it establishes, get rid of it right at the beginning, before it becomes problematic. So if we see a small Phragmites stand coming in, to parts by the marinas in Montague, let's attack it right now. Asian carp is the invasive species most people are concerned about. And again, depending upon what happens with the connectivity in the Chicago Shipping and Sanitary Canal and maybe up through the Maumee River, we want to make sure that there's monitoring in place. And that if water levels, right now the Maumee River at the marsh area, the water levels are so dry there's nothing that can cross them right now. But if the water levels get back up in the future, they may flood, just like we have in the Chicago. I need a slide here. But the Chicago Shipping and Sanitary Canal is adjacent to the Des Plaines River, and so regardless of what we do in terms of stopping the carp from moving up the canal, they might still be able to get in through the Des Plaines if this area floods. There's only a 1.5 foot elevation difference between these two. So if you have a big flood event, and we're dealing with all of this stuff downstream of where this connection is, it's not going to do us any good if they can get in upstream of that. So, and I'm not answering your question very intelligently, so I apologize, I'm kind of jumping all over the place. But yes, invasive species, major problem, already a major problem, and we need to be vigilant about that, and climate change can impact that. One example of that we've seen in Muskegon Lake is that we found an invasive, harmful algal species that is subtropical in origin. It's a little blue-green algal called Celery Fields, and you wouldn't think it would grow in the Great Lakes. We identified it for the first time in the Great Lakes in Muskegon Lake. So here's a potential toxic bloom former that shouldn't be here. But warming temperatures presumably are responsible for it allowing it to survive. It wasn't responsible for it getting there. We don't know how it got there, but it shouldn't be able to survive if it did get there. So there's another example of those kinds of issues associated with that. And just one aside. We spend a lot of time and effort on the Asian carp. It gets a lot of attention. The suckers jump, and so they're a media, darling, thank you. They're not here yet. I personally don't think there'll be a problem in the open water of the Great Lakes. There's simply, at least in Lake Michigan, there's not enough algae for them to grow. But they might be problems in the coastal areas. But while we're talking about that, while we're devoting an incredible amount of money and resources, we have almost 1 quadrillion zebra and quagga mussels in Lake Michigan, fundamentally changing the bioenergetics of our lake. They are literally sucking the life, because they're filter feeders. They're sucking the life out of Lake Michigan. They're changing the chemistry. You imagine the volume of water in that lake, and we can detect changes. The calcium levels are going down because they use calcium in their shells. So there's enough of them. There are mounds 5 feet high, at 90-meter depths in Lake Michigan. It's mind-boggling. And because we can't see them, because they're underwater, unlike silver carp, which you can see because they jump, we don't put nearly the amount of resources into this problem which is existing right now and is fundamentally changing the way that energy flows in our lake. So, we talk about how we respond as humans to these problems, but we're a visual species, right? And we're a crisis-oriented species. We don't act till the crisis is in front of us. It's tough to get ahead of the curve. I've talked enough. We need to turn this over. So, thank you.
I'll be brief. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Steinman for a wonderful talk. It was very informative to me. I'm a transplant from the Detroit area, so I now consider this home, and it's great to learn about the White Lake area. On behalf of the library, again, I would just like to thank the sponsors for their funding of this project. I think it's a great project. We're very excited at the library to be part of this. I want to thank all of you for attending today. Shelly is very pleased with the attendance, and we feel real great about the project moving forward. The library is very pleased to be sponsoring this project. It is a good match to the library's mission, developed in 2008, which states the White Lake Community Library as a cultural destination will lead the community to the world's information and ideas, and be the link for enrichment, entertainment, and lifelong learning. It is also a match to our strategic plan, which lays out a new and exciting role, that of serving as a comprehensive source of White Lake area history, genealogy resources, and a convener of community partnerships for historical education and preservation. Our strategic plan also specifically outlines a plan for becoming a center for local history activities and community partnerships. We are thrilled to be able to do this here at the library. I'm sure under the guidance of our director, Shelly Williams, and with Tanya's assistance, we are very excited to be able to offer this opportunity for the community to participate. We encourage you to get involved in this project, such as attending educational events, assisting with the oral history component, and submitting information and photos. This project's success will be dependent on your participation. Thank you in advance. Also, if you haven't had, there's a few goodies left here. Please have some, and again, thank you for coming.
I want to make sure you knew the website name, which is restoringwhitelake.com. So it's up there.
Have something come together.